Welcome to the new video on the channel. And this is the first theoretical part on the broad topic of modularity in architecture for games, in which I will share everything I know and think about the subject matter. Now, looking ahead, in the second practical part that will follow soon, we will decompose our blockout into a modular constructor and do it live in Maya and export it into Unreal Engine 5. For those who are new to the channel, this video is yet another episode in a large breakdown of my workflow as I develop this game-ready intricate cottage in Unreal Engine 5 based on the concept art by Xiaosheng Bai, whose ArtStation profile can be found in the description below. And I do this work with respect to all the classical level and environment art principles, as well as relatively new Unreal Engine 5 technologies for environment art production. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Here's our blockout, roughly as I left it in the last art blockout video. Take a look if you haven't seen it yet, and if you're interested in how we created this blockout based on Mr. Xiaosheng Bai's concept art. So here's our blockout, and now it's time to move on. We already know roughly how we're going to texture the walls. We even have a collection of materials, and you might think, what's stopping us from taking this model as it is, just selecting everything with the mouse, exporting it to Unreal Engine, roughly in the shape in which we already have this proxy model here, and then continue to refine the details, modeling on top more and more details, do the correct UV unwrapping, assign the various necessary materials, and in general continue to work in the same spirit without worrying about any modularity or assembly. And to answer this question, I invite you to my Miro board, where you will find this small question and answer diagram. And here is the central main question with which we will begin this conversation. Should I disassemble/assemble my cottage before texturing and importing it into the game engine? And before answering this question, let's discuss what is actually written here in general. Should I disassemble or assemble? And why are there two words here instead of one, and what does that mean? So when we work on architectural objects, whether in actual production or for a portfolio work, we start with a reference 98% of the time. Concept art, photography, or even architectural drawings, blueprints, some kind of initial visual design. In our case, we have 2D concept art. And in our case, the artist who drew this cottage drew and designed this object based on his intended architectural composition. He also probably used photo references and he synthesized various elements of architectural design. And here's what's important. We can certainly see repeating elements in this concept, like these supports, like stone arches in the windows, the wooden logs, and so on. But even despite the presence of repeating elements, we can say with almost certainty that the artist did not plan any modularity for us at all. It just was not part of his task. And this means that after replicating his design in 3D and obtaining our 3D blockout, we will engage in disassembly, segmenting and dividing the whole model into its constituent parts, which we will later reassemble in the engine to obtain certain benefits, which we will discuss later. And at the modular kit planning stage, we will usually decompose an existing architectural design. There are situations when the modular constructor somehow precedes a specific reference or concept. Here I have this small standard architecture modular kit I made for this video. When we talk about real production in games where modularity is important for gameplay, such as in parkour or destructible architecture systems or certain others, there may be situations where level design, whose work precedes the work of art, uses a standard modular kit or several such kits. In such a scenario, the level designer assembles the level blockout in a modular way, and only then, taking this modularity into account, do the concept artists work, overpainting the blockout but preserving its modular nature. It could be the level artists who perform the function of concept artists in this case as well. And in this situation, we can talk about assembly instead of disassembly. However, this is a bit of a philosophical question. Even when using standard modular kits at the level design stage, these kits must somehow reflect the overall direction of the architectural design, which means that their creation is also based on references or concepts. And so we're back to disassembly as we decompose this reference or concept. That's why I say disassembly and rarely assembly when referring to 3D architecture for games. And next, I say before texturing and importing to game engine. This is also not a random remark, but one that carries with it some interesting considerations. And what is this about? Let's go back to Maya, to our scene. When we model anything, we already work in a kind of a modular fashion by default. Or at least we reuse repetitive elements. Like these roofs here, for example. It would not occur to us to model each such piece of roof from scratch. We would copy it and paste, copy and paste. And that is why I added this caveat to the question. For us, what matters in this question is how we will handle the object and how to divide it when importing it into the game engine. Because again, before this import, we work in a modular way as much as it is convenient for us and as much as it fits into the structural logic of the model. In addition, there are different approaches to working with game engines. In the description below the video, I will leave a link to a very interesting old conversation, Environment Art of God of War, in which the lead environment artist of Santa Monica says that Maya is their game editor at their studio. Of course, they probably have their own rules for designing modular kits and instancing objects within a scene, but imagine how different this is from our pipeline with Unreal Engine. And how much does this affect the process of working with modular kits or with bespoke geometry as well? It has a significant impact. And I know for sure that there are several other modern AAA games that are developed in a similar way, with graphics and levels being created and assembled directly in the modeling application. And that's why also I'm making this caveat. But nevertheless, we work in Unreal Engine. We have to import things after modeling them and before using them. So let's continue. Now our question is completely clear. I'll read it again. Do I need to disassemble, assemble before importing to the game engine? And of course we have two possible answers. Yes and no. And in addition, we have my favorite follow-up question. Why? Why should we do this? What are the benefits of disassembling the static mesh? As I said at the beginning of the video, why don't we just continue working with a single proxy mesh, bringing it to completion? Let's answer this clarifying question why before moving on. Here are a few answers, a few reasons. And in most cases, even one of them is enough to break down, to decompose a static mesh into its constituent parts. First is occlusion. An occlusion refers to any situation where part of a 3D object is blocked or occluded from the camera's view by another solid object. It's a key concept in real-time rendering, because the GPU shouldn't waste time drawing pixels that are not visible to the player. The technology behind the performance optimization here is known as occlusion culling, and here's what it does. Let's take our column, copy it, and place it behind the cottage wall. And now we have two columns on either side of the cottage. And as long as this column is not visible behind the building, it does not participate in the rendering pipeline and no resources are spent on it. And we can enable nanite overdraw visualization to make it even clearer. Here we have the blockout of the cottage displayed in black, because it is not yet in nanite. However, you can see that its walls occlude the entire column, and what's more, and this is the beauty of nanite technology, they occlude hidden triangles, not just the whole mesh. And this was not the case before. Previously, if you saw even one triangle of a static mesh, the entire static mesh and all its polygons were rendered. And this is one of the main advantages of nanite, the ability to cull down the unused invisible polygons of a single mesh. And nevertheless, the concept of occlusion culling is the basis of real-time graphics, so decomposition is beneficial because some architectural elements hide others from the player's camera, which reduces the load on the GPU. The second reason is reusability potential, and as a result, resource savings from reusing repetitive elements, which again has a beneficial effect on performance in some cases when used correctly. It should be noted that if used incorrectly, reusing repetitive elements can, on the contrary, negatively affect performance or have no effect on performance but take extra time to produce, but more on that later. For now, let's focus on the general rule. Let's return to the scene with our standard modular kit. Let's say our hypothetical goal is to create a small street in a modern city consisting mainly of houses of the same type and single architectural style. Or we can imagine that our constructor consists of a slightly larger number of elements with the same metrics but different materials and details, which will allow us to assemble houses in several organically combined architectural styles, and thus one set of 40-50 elements will allow us, in theory, to assemble this street and the entire game level on it. And if we have such a goal, I repeat, a modern city, several streets that make up the game level, then the reusability potential of this modular constructor will be extremely high. A single wall module with a cutout for a window or door will be used dozens of times on the level, which is a high indicator. Or the window or door itself will also be used many times in different contexts for different architectural objects. Now let's look at examples of the different reuse potential of elements of our cottage. The simplest example is this support, which obviously has a very high reuse potential. Even in this context, even in our cottage, it can be reused dozens of times. Obviously, it will serve perfectly as a separate element for other buildings in this style if we are already building a street in a fantasy town. The same goes for other standalone elements, such as these wooden columns, for example. But now, let's finally look at the elements that have relatively low reuse potential. A good example is these two windows in the very corner. And this is a very unusual architectural solution, and it only works well in this artistic context. And when I talk about context, I mean a specific composition. And the concept artist, understood perfectly well what he was doing when he drew these windows. He detailed the existing large forms in the given context, taking into account the fantasy style, resulting in this unusual solution that we as level artists have to work with. We cannot abandon it in favor of the standard, although this is sometimes done, but I consider it bad practice. And so we need to work with it. Let's say we decide to use this module after all, one corner element in the hope that we can reuse it somewhere else on the map in the future. And indeed, there is a chance that it will work in another architectural context, but it is lower than the chances of reusing supports, standalone columns, or standard construction elements in the case of modern architecture. That is why we talk about the potential for reuse. It is always a matter of degree. When the potential is low, we should consider whether there are other reasons to separate this corner with two windows into a separate module, for example, or whether it makes sense to simply import the entire square structure of walls into the editor without a roof. Or perhaps it is worth considering how else these walls can be divided, and most importantly, understanding why. Another example is this roof. So far I have a plan to divide it into two pieces, this one and that one. And again, you can see the potential for reusing this piece is very low. It will be used with a 98% probability only in the context of this entire roof. Then the reasonable question arises, why don't we import the entire roof as a single piece? And we will make this decision by analyzing all the reasons from the list on the mirror board, not just the reason for reuse. It is worth remembering that this is only one of the reasons to disassemble the mesh. It depends heavily on the project, the game, and the type of level you're working on, but in my experience this reason is relevant in 50% of cases and not relevant in the other half. Although many of my colleagues, when explaining the essence of modularity in level and environment art, often cite this reason as the main, if not the only one, and elevate it to an absolute, which in my opinion, by doing so they undeservedly ignore the nuances that we all encounter in the course of our work. Let's move on. The next type of reason to disassemble might be gameplay reason. And I'll say right away that in today's conversation, I am referring to different experiences from different game engines, not just Unreal Engine. So one of these gameplay reasons could be collision and the bounding box of an object. Unreal Engine and its collision system actually allows you to work with geometry of any complexity, but there are game engines and pipelines that require decomposing the rendered geometry into relatively small elements, since complex geometry requires a complex collision structure, and that is not always supported by some engines very well. Another example of gameplay reason might be destructible buildings, and the destruction system which will allow us to have such buildings would relate on modularity a lot to achieve better performance and smooth gaming experience. Another type of reason is lighting reasons. Much of this is also relevant for Unreal Engine 5, but it was particularly noticeable in Unreal Engine 4. And there were two widely used lighting models in UE4. Baked lighting, which required one UV channel for each object to bake the light texture itself, and dynamic lighting, which worked on the basis of a distance field mesh, an automatically generated proxy model used to calculate the light. And we have both these systems still in Unreal Engine 5, though the dynamic lighting is now replaced with Lumen. And it should be noted that Lumen in Unreal Engine 5 also uses distance field meshes, but the technology itself has become more accurate. And nevertheless, both of these approaches required a certain amount of decomposition and did not handle complex geometry very well. Now let's enable distance field mesh rendering in Unreal Engine, and you can see that even though Unreal Engine 5 can handle complex geometry in general, we still lose details, and frankly, we cannot import and use overly complex static meshes for the lighting to work correctly. We need to decompose such meshes, and then the automatic distance field mesh generator will do its job much more cleanly, and we will have higher quality dynamic lighting. For example, this wooden fence was not generated at all, but when we assemble the final house, each of these posts will be an instance of a single static mesh, and they will all have detailed, correct distance field mesh at low resolution. With baked lighting, the situation was slightly different. We had to save texture space for light maps, so we reused geometry and decomposed it. Overall, baked lighting worked better with a set of simpler shapes, especially large ones such as architecture, than with a single complex model. The last reason I will mention is flexibility in use, the convenience of the iteration process. Again, as a rule, let's imagine a simple situation. We have a modern building assembled in the engine from a standard modular constructor, and we already consider it complete. But suddenly, towards the end of the work on the map, the level designer comes to us and says that after some testing and reflection, we have decided that this window on the second floor gives a big advantage to snipers. and one of the teams consequently. So let's remove it. So we simply delete the window, copy the wall, and replace the window with it, and voila, everything is ready in 3 seconds right in the game engine. I'm not doing this in Maya now, but imagine that we could be in the game engine. The essence is the same. And this is an example of flexibility when working with a modular kit, which is undoubtedly something to strive for. However, there are a couple of nuances, of course. This example I just told is very primitive to begin with. In practice, things will probably not be so simple, and you will encounter many unconventional tasks. In practice, a level designer may ask you to move the corner of a building by 0.3 meters. And this automatically goes beyond the scope of our modular system. And then we will be faced with a dilemma: either create a single unique corner module, rebuild the building with that corner, and hope that we will not receive any more similar requests. Or we will consider that if there are several such requests, it would be more profitable to simply not bother ourselves with modules, but import all the walls as a single static mesh. It is likely that a skilled modeler will find it just as easy and quick, and even cheaper and more efficient, to change the original geometry in the 3D modeling application and press the reimport button, rather than assembling the architecture as a complex modular puzzle. Personally, I don't often see the modular approach providing flexibility in 100% of cases. It's good if it helps in 30% of cases and doesn't interfere in other unconventional situations, which are always plentiful in the game development. So consider this flexibility as an ideal situation and something that we probably still should strive for, but also take it with a grain of salt. Especially considering that with the evolution of game graphics, the accuracy of architectural reconstruction in games with realistic graphics is increasing, as is the complexity and diversity of architectural designs, especially when it comes to fantasy and fantastic settings. All of this inevitably works against the convenience of working with modules, since reality is always a little chaotic, always a little inaccurate. And complex design is complex precisely because it contradicts approximation and standardization, and the flexibility of a modular system is precisely approximation and standardization. But this is all a bit philosophical, and we'll talk more about it at the end of the video with examples. And now that we know all about the reasons, let's hurry up and answer our question. And of course, we have two possible answers: yes or no. And let's first consider the answer no. Let's say that somehow none of these reasons are relevant to us and our game, or our particular situation. And you may think, how is that possible? And I'll give you an example. If we answer no, we don't need to disassemble our architecture, then I'll say, do it as you would do the prop. And as an example, let's take a look here. The same architectural structure, the Roman Colosseum. Two different games, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood and Civilization. Two different genres, and therefore different approaches to developing environment assets. Now let's analyze this by looking at all our reasons. First is occlusion. In Assassin's Creed, there's a third-person camera, large spaces, and relatively high detailed environments, which means that every arch of the Colosseum and every column has a significant number of polygons. And this means that occlusion culling will work pretty effectively, rendering only those modules and triangles that the player's camera sees and saving resources on modules that the camera does not see at any given moment. In Civilization, the camera is positioned from above, at an angle, isometric camera, and as far as I remember, it can be rotated around a selected point in the world, which means that at any given moment, we will see about 2/3 of the Colosseum model and not see 1/3. At the same time, the Colosseum model itself is, first, stylized. Second, it has sufficient detail only for a camera position located at a bird's eye view. And third, as a consequence of the previous points, the number of triangles here is relatively small, at least significantly smaller than in the Colosseum for Assassin's Creed. And based on all this, I conclude that occlusion culling will not give me any significant benefits, or rather, these benefits will be incomparable to the amount of additional work, and the decomposition into separate elements will most likely create unnecessary polygons. And therefore it seems quite obvious and logical in this case to use an approach similar to that used for ordinary props. Perhaps there are some standalone elements here that are copied and placed in the engine. Perhaps these roof elements, I can't say for sure. But the building frame itself is clearly imported into the engine without any disassembly, unlike the second example, Assassin's Creed. And you may rightly think that this is such an exceptional case that it only applies to strategy games or games with a top-down camera. However, I will tell you that this is not the only case and that there are other examples. Even in first-person or third-person games, we may have some key architectural objects for visual composition that are nevertheless outside the gameplay area, which the player cannot reach or interact with. In this case, there is also a chance that occlusion culling will not provide us with much benefit, since, for example, we will only see such objects from a certain angle. Moving on to other reasons, very quickly. Reusability. Why do we need reusability if we only have one Coliseum in the game of Civilization? Everything is clear with collision, either there's none or it is the simplest capsule for gameplay purposes. Let's assume we have no problems with lighting and flexibility. Again, what flexibility are we talking about if we either have a Coliseum or we don't? Now let's look at Assassin's Creed. Here we can immediately see that many reasons for disassembly are relevant. Reusability potential is very high, at least within the context of the Coliseum itself. We will literally copy each arch and column 60 times or even more. There are also gameplay reasons. You can climb the walls of the Coliseum, which is parkour mechanics, meaning strict metrics across the entire wall area required, so it's more profitable to build it with a modular kit. I don't know anything about the lighting features in their engine, but we already have enough reasons in this situation to say yes. Yes, we need to disassemble this Coliseum and assemble it on the level of its component parts. And then the next question we ask ourselves is, how do I assemble? What is the scale? How much reusability potential can I achieve? Let's open up our concept. Let's say our game is a third-person action game, and we understand that we will be disassembling this house into its constituent parts. Furthermore, if we continue to fantasize about the theme of our game for which we're making this cottage, we can imagine that we need to make not just one such cottage, but an entire town with several houses in a similar architectural style, but with many different elements. In this case, our only option is to try to plan a modular kit. The more cottages in this architectural style in our town, the more beneficial this modular kit will be for us. And how exactly to divide it is the main question you will ask yourself every time with different architectural structures. This question can be divided into two sub-questions. What is the scale, meaning the scale of the details of our constructor, and how much reuse potential can I achieve? And this is an important question because if the reuse potential is low in different contexts, we run the risk of falling behind the speed at which such content is produced. Now, let's go to Photoshop and try to roughly plan our disassembly. And first I would like to consider the structural logic of this structure when planning the modular kit. We can see that by and large this cottage consists of several relatively self-sufficient structures. These structures are integral in their design. There are 4 or 5, together with the column, of integral structures. And it would seem that these 5 structures, from the point of view of reusability, could already be considered a small kit. Each of these structures could, in theory, be replaced with something else of similar or even different proportions. And if we had no other reasons to break these models down further, then from the point of view of reusability and our theoretical plan to build a town of cottages in a similar style, even such a large-scaled breakdown would be pretty convenient. And this is the beginning of our thoughts on the scale of a modular kit. A modular kit could well be like this. But what if we could get even more benefits, even more variations and flexibility? So let's break it down further. The next step, again guided solely by the structural logic of the building itself, we can separate the roofs. For example, let's separate this main roof. And let's think, can we imagine this stone first floor, this foundation, but with a different roof? Yes, I think we certainly can. This roof is obviously a build-up above the first floor. If we imagine how such a building could be constructed, in the neighboring building it could be a roof with a slightly different design, lower or any other, or it could not be there at all. As a result, it is clear that in a new context, both elements can work, so it makes sense to separate the roofs. Now let's outline this roof. And look, if we ask how much this roof will be used in different contexts, it seems to me that there is less opportunity for reuse here. Again, as long as we're talking within the existing scale, it is clear that if and when we cut everything into 2 to 4 meter pieces, the question of reuse will be different. However, looking ahead, we will separate it. Firstly, still guided by the structural logic of the architecture, but secondly, guided by occlusion culling, which is even more important, since we're using baked displacement, and we will use it on both the roof and the walls. In addition, we can mention prefabs here. At the end of the big topic on modularity, I will be collecting prefabs, and we will definitely talk about them in detail. Essentially, prefabs are a group of static mesh objects, and in fact, for the potential of reuse, static meshes that we will import into Unreal Engine from Maya are not so important, but how the prefabs are designed and how convenient it will be to work with a modular kit consisting of prefabs is important. In the case of our cottage and theoretical city, I would group these 5 structures, excluding the roofs, into prefabs and assemble this city from such a large scale blocks. Of course, we lack the design to really plan the entire city. In real production, the right step would be to have concepts for several variations of houses in the city, or even all possible variations, and based on this pool of concepts, we could start working on creating a full-fledged modular system and choose the right scale of its elements. Let's break it down further. These supports are quite obvious. Such freestanding elements are usually always imported separately, they have high reuse potential, and even in this context, they are used many times. Finally, we've come to the most interesting part. We're left with the frame of the building, this beveled corner, a wall with a small window, a wall with a large window, and other walls, which in essence, following the structural logic of the building, are a single wall, built brick by brick. And it's not modular in nature. These supports were attached to the wall separately, they are modular in nature, but this wall is independent. So what should we do with it? And we have 2 approaches. Just like at the beginning of our conversation, to disassemble or not to disassemble. In games, we do both, depending on the same list of reasons. If we leave this yellow block as a single static mesh, it might be called differently, but I remember the term shell, so I will call it the shell approach or bespoke approach. And if we cut it into segments that are multiples of 2 meters, similar to the ones I showed earlier in our standard modular kit, this is called the modular approach, and this is where the confusion often arises. In the case of the shell bespoke approach, we are only talking about these walls. It is clear that all kinds of wooden shutters, such as this windowsill, will be separated again and will have the potential to be reused. This yellow block will, of course, always come in a prefab with a brown painted roof, with supports and shutters, and with this logic and scale of modularity, it will function as a unit, as the same module in essence, just on a larger scale. With the modular approach, we will cut this wall into pieces that are multiples of 2 in width in meters. We will have a wall with a trapezoidal window, this corner, a wall with a small window, and so on. And here I must make a disclaimer. I'm going to slightly criticize this approach, but I will criticize it for one reason only, namely from the point of view of reuse potential. So if we divide the wall into such a granular modular kit, similar to a standard modular kit, it may seem that we will have even more opportunities for reuse, that we will be able to assemble first floors of different lengths, widths, with different windows, and so on. But look, Even within the same context, here we have one type of window, here a second, here a third, here a fourth, and each of them will have its own specific module size. Somewhere we will fit into 2 meters, and somewhere not, somewhere into 4. This corner windows will only go with a corner, so we'll need a separate corner, and so on. That is, even to break down the cottage into such a kit, we will already get quite a lot of elements. But the most interesting thing is that if, after we do this, we take these elements and try to assemble a new cottage from them without any additional design, a second variation in the same architectural style, we will hardly be able to assemble anything sensible from this kit alone. It is unlikely that we will be able to come up with a worthy alternative to this architectural design. Most likely we will end up only being able to adequately assemble this cottage from all these numerous parts and slap a couple ridiculous extensions into the neighboring ones at most. Some may argue that by adding new elements that fit in with the matrix of this initial modular kit, we may be able to put together something interesting, and it seems possible. But here's something else to think about. Let's imagine that we're building a neighboring cottage and want to increase its width, so we extend the wall. Let's imagine we just take and copy and paste this section with a window and put it to the left. This change in itself is not an adequate variation, but something that destroys the architectural design. This means that we will need a fundamentally different roof now. In other words, each such decision complicates our modular kit, and the more complex and larger the modular kit, the more difficult it is to use, and the more time is spent on the production of the level or architecture in particular. It's like comparing assembling a 1000-piece jigsaw puzzle to assembling a 10-piece jigsaw puzzle for small children. And yes, I will say that there are situations where 1000-piece puzzle is justified, but only if such a modular kit is planned in advance for the entire architectural theme for which it will be used. Without the modular design of most elements preceding the planning of the modular kit, such a modular kit is almost impossible to work with if aimed for high-quality architectural designs. When we ask ourselves this question, how, we are essentially planning the disassembly and the modularity. And there are two main answers to this question which roughly correspond to what we discussed about shells and modules. Let's just go through my diagram for the sake of completeness, and then I'll show you some interesting examples. So here we have modularity, which I define as the logic of disassembly, assembly. And here we have a bespoke approach. This means unique, unconventional pieces of geometry that, for one reason or another, do not need to be broken down further. And you can see two arrows pointing in both directions here, which means that, as a rule, we use both approaches and rarely use just one or the other in real production. Moreover, this classification is quite arbitrary because the very concept of modularity is scalable, as we discussed earlier when talking about disassembly in Photoshop. And what do we end up with? Do it disassembled, taking into account occlusion, but have less reuse potential within different contexts, which is not always bad and sometimes even good. If we go down the modular route, I would highlight two categories of modular objects: matrix-based flat surface modules and reusable standalone elements. And this is probably the best time to talk over the basics of matrix-based modularity. So let's jump back into my so-called standard modular kit in Maya and take a closer look at the core principles. Let us take a closer look at the standard modular kit and discuss the basics of creating and working with such modular kits. Now what you see now is a fairly simple kit, and of course every modular kit in real production will be significantly different. Nevertheless, we can discuss all the nuances using this simple example. Let's first look at an excellent finalized example of modular architecture. And this is a cool house from Clock Studio on ArtStation. And these are the people who made it. It was all put together in Unreal Engine from modules like this. And this is a really clean, harmonious, and beautiful example of using a modular system that really fits here and works 100%. There is a lot of geometry in the elements, so occlusion culling will work well. The architecture itself is 19th century Jacobean revival, which is a revival of the original 17th century style, meaning richly decorated walls and a modular structure at its core. In general, it is an ideal candidate to be built by modular kit. Let's return to our simple modular kit to discuss general principles and some nuances. As usual, we'll start with a reference, and let's say we want to build a very simple house with flat walls, perhaps at the construction stage, but that's not so important. The first question that arises is, how wide should these modular elements be? How wide should the openings be? What proportions overall should the wall have? The answer will be determined by texturing, unsurprisingly. And here I have rulers set up. As you can see, 2 meters wide. I have centimeters in Maya, so it's 200 centimeters and 4 meters high. So the height is not as important as the width. As a rule, when we work with architecture for which it is logical to produce a modular kit, this is clearly visible even in the example of this house, where each floor is marked by some kind of trim. Here, look, the first floor is covered, the second floor is covered, the foundation is covered with trim. And that is, the structure of the architecture itself will tell us what height our modules should be, and they will very often be different depending on the specific structure. But width is another matter. In 70% of cases, or even more, the width of my modules will be a multiple of 2. Thus, the smallest element will be 2 meters wide. Here I have 2 meters, here 2 meters, here 4 meters. The wall is 4 meters. Here's a corner. It looks like 1 meter, but that's not true. It's 2 meters because it's a corner. And so on. And we can have any number that is a multiple of 2, 4, 8, 10, 12, 14, and so on, as long as it makes sense. And why is it this way and not another? Why can't we have such a basic module of 3 meters, or 1 meter in the case of flat seamless wall? Right now we're only talking about modules from which we can assemble something like this. And look, my tiling texture fits perfectly into the neighboring module and continues seamlessly. And so on, along the surface of the house. Now let's return to the question of why the width must be a multiple of 2. And the short answer, because 2 meters is a clean unit that is convenient and easy to use with standard textures traditionally used in game graphics, namely 512, 1024, and 2048, while still achieving the correct and desired level of detail and texture resolution on the model. And the core thing here is this textile density. This is the value that determines the texture resolution on a 3D model. Textile density is the number of texture pixels, or texels for short, per meter, or other unit of length, of the model in the 3D world. And here in Maya I have centimeters set by default, and I'm kinda used to it. And what you see now is 10.24 pixels per centimeter of the 3D model, which is equivalent to 1024 pixels per meter of the 3D model. And that's with a texture resolution of 2048. And here I will refer to the standards of gaming industry. We usually use a textile density of 1024 for AAA games with a first-person camera. Well, or for portfolio work, this is a good value. Textile density of 512 pixels per meter is used for third-person games. And there are many exceptions and nuances about that, but that's not what we're talking about right now. And look, here on my grid, one cell equals 1 meter cubed. That is, I have 1 meter, 1024 pixels, here's the second meter, 1024 pixels, and so we get 1024 plus 1024 equals 2048, which is exactly the resolution of my texture. If we want to make the resolution lower, it won't cost us anything. Let's say we're going to use a texture with a resolution of 1024 pixels. And look, with a texel of 1024 per meter and a texture of 1024, we won't be able to map this module evenly across the entire texture area. But as soon as we reduce it by half, and hence the convenience of working with 2 meters, we get exactly 512. That is the working texel density with the working texture resolution. And the answer to this question of why we're tied to the sequence of power of 2 textures in computer graphics, this 8, 16, 32, 128, 512, 1024, and so on, is not something I know off the top of my head, but you can Google it yourself. It is a strictly technical issue related to MIPS of the textures, which is roughly the reduction of resolution at a distance. We talked about the external proportions of the module. Now let's talk a bit about the internal proportions. For example, the width of a doorway, the height of a doorway or window, and so on. Of course, in games we try to take into account the real proportions of our world, certain standards, or we deliberately deviate from them, referring to references or concept art. And here I have the almost real proportions of my interior door. If you're looking for standard proportions of this kind, ChatGPT can also be a great help. But there is, of course, an even more important influence on the proportions of openings, the gameplay influence. It often deviates from real proportions, but does so in favor of the quality of the gaming experience. As an example, the distance from the floor to the edge of the window can be critical for your character to climb inside correctly if your game has such mechanics. Or the height of a door, for example, may have a fixed value so that the camera following the player in a third-person game behaves correctly and doesn't jump when it hits the wall above the opening, and so on. It is impossible to list all these nuances, and there are too many and they're quite unique to each game, but I hope it all makes sense. Another point worth mentioning is thickness. Right now, I have a thickness of 0.5 meter. And this is just a convenient value for illustration purposes. In practice, thicknesses will always depend on the task at hand. The important thing here is whether we are going to do the interior and whether the interior module should differ from the exterior. There are simple cases where it will be enough to use 2 sides of one module to display the exterior and interior, for example, by assigning 2 materials. And there are other cases where we will have 2 different modules. They will be mirrored, and we will place them close to each other. And in this case, the thickness is also calculated with an eye to realism and gameplay. If it is a modern American residential house, for example, we will have a thinner wall, and you can Google what exactly this thickness will be. If it is a Renaissance cathedral module, let's say, then it will be thicker, and so on. As for internal polygons, in the popular version, I would say they remain, meaning in this version we will have waterproof mesh. Polygons are usually used sparingly in this version. But often, you can see that the modules have no thickness at all. Like here, for example. Here you can see on the corner module that there's no thickness. And there's this transparent back face. It's a one-sided module. And this is generally a good option, normal and functional. But there are problems with it, depending on the game engine and the technologies used. For example, with such modules, some lighting scenarios in computer games don't always work well. It can also cause problems for occlusion culling, which we talked about earlier. In our case, with our cottage, we will encounter this problem, and we'll solve it in quite a non-standard way, which we will come to later. Another important point is the position of the pivot. The most basic rule is that the pivot should be located in the corner for such standard modules, snapped to the furthest corner vertex. This allows you to conveniently move it along the grid, rotate it to even values, and generally makes it easy to work with. At the same time, when our modules have thickness, it is correct to place the pivot at the inner corner, at this hidden wall, and not at the outer corner, as I had done before. I was doing it wrong. And this is done to make it convenient to work. When you have an interior and exterior, then you can attach two mirrored modules to a single point on a mirror grid, for example. And it is better to plan a complex modular constructor right away with the pivot at the inner corner. Of course, there might be many exceptions. For example, radial modules, when it is convenient to place the pivot in the center of a circle and copy the modules exclusively in a circle relative to its center. And well, in general, the main rule here is to make it as convenient as possible for you to work with. It seems we're coming to the end of this topic. So this is the standard kit I have come up with as an example. And of course, in reality, you will see and work with completely different kits. For example, a common approach is to use columns along the facade, as in the house designed by Clock Studio. When there are separate elements at the ends of the modules, they hide the joints between two modules. In this case, there is no point in tiling the texture correctly under these columns, unless you want both. But by and large, this arrangement with columns gives you greater flexibility. You can have odd-numbered module widths, perhaps 1 meter, 3 meters, and so on, but it is not applicable everywhere, so be careful. Everything else related to the modular system is a matter of detail, and all problems will be solved in accordance with the structural logic of the object most of the times. Now that we have finished with this basics digression, let us return to the diagram of questions and answers and continue from where we left. And the second category, reusable standalone elements. These are relatively independent, recurring elements, for example, a door, or even this arch, these supports. Such elements usually cause the least problems, they are easy to read at the planning stage, don't require binding to specific metrics, but are modular in nature. And these two categories form our modular kit. Now let's look at some examples and try to apply this logic as a whole to different architectural structures. Here we have a small selection of photos of different architecture. It will help us understand how to choose between these two approaches, especially in relation to this block. When should we plan and use a modular system for the core structures in architecture? And when can we ignore this and safely use a more bespoke approach? Now let's first look at this example, as it is the simplest and most understandable. This is a combi block. It is even called a block, as this type of house is constructed from modules or panels in the real world. And we literally have no reason not to follow this logic and not to make a modular constructor here to assemble such houses on the level. A wall with a window cut out, balconies with variations in color and materials, and finally the windows themselves. The same applies to this house. Although the seams are not visible here, but given the simple texturing which is usual for modern architecture, all this will also be done modularly and quickly. The same applies when we work with more complex historical architecture. And our concept, I remind you, is precisely historical architecture. And here we are clearly dealing with a modular structure as well. We have even steps between the repeating elements. We can make a wall like this, one like that, a column, a long column, and then we can quickly assemble this structure from modular repeating elements. And this is very clearly visible. And here, there's one important point that I would like to draw your attention to. And this is particularly evident here in the example of the House of Parliament. As a rule, Gothic, late medieval, or Renaissance architecture is characterized by a large amount of additional geometry, decorative elements, and mouldings. And these elements, such as the ones here, can also be imported separately and copied within the prefab. And it is important to note that in this case, we're no longer dealing with flat walls, but with fairly complex geometry, a complex model, which is very advantageous to optimize using occlusion culling and thus modularity. And this is because the more polygons an element has, the more advantageous it is for it not to participate in rendering until it is visible to the camera. Now, also in this example, thanks to the simplicity of the materials and the emphasis on geometric details, the modular approach is more than justified and logical in the case of such classical or neoclassical architecture. Here too, the advantage of modular approach, in this case radial modules, is quite obvious. We would create 3 elements and copy them radially to assemble a dome like this. Now if we look at medieval architecture, castle architecture, and let me remind you again, our cottage is kind of at the junction of this medieval castle architecture and late medieval, more developed architecture, but overall we're talking about medieval fantasy, and therefore castles will definitely be among our references. And when we look at this photo, I think everyone immediately understands and feels the difference from the previous references with the structural logic of this architecture. It is no longer modular. It is no longer like this. There are no more of these even indents, repeating blocks everywhere, calculated dimensions. Take a look at this gatehouse. Here's a loophole. Here's a loophole further from the corner. This entrance is a meter or a meter and a half lower than the front one. You have these unique little windows here. Here is a cutout for the roof, which you will never see anywhere else probably. Or this element, which you would do well to copy to the other side of this structure, and even then, it's not a given that it will be the same on the other side by design. And then there's the logic of this intersection of different walls and the construction of the walls themselves. One is shorter, the other is different, entering at an uneven angle, and so on. So when we look at this kind of architecture, we immediately understand how to plan modularity. You can start highlighting with color right away. Here's one element, second element, third element, and so on. But what do we see here? I really like this wall as an example of how a modular system is not always good and convenient. And look at how the windows are arranged here, not in a single line. They are all different shapes. Even within the same shape, their proportions vary. Their arrangement relative to each other is not uniform. And all this is an important characteristic, an important feature, and a sign of the era. And when we repeat these forms, we work authentically, and authenticity is an important property for the genre of realism. And in this reference, it is the same. Windows of different sizes, unevenly spaced, ventilation openings, and so on. No artist wanted to go and break this wall down into a standard modular construction kit 2 meters wide, with strange offsets, non-uniform heights, and so on. And if you try to do this, you will waste a lot of time on something you don't need to spend time on, and you will gain nothing from such a modular kit, even if you manage to decompose it according to this reference. For our cottage, the approach I described with more bespoke structural geometry definitely has a right to exist, and, under certain conditions, is preferable to a full-fledged modular system. But these conditions I will not meet with this cottage, mainly because of displacement, which we will talk about later. And now let me show you one example from real production in which the artist, fortunately for us, shows how this bespoke method is applied. Let's go to the ArtStation page of artist Maciej Kaputa, and this is Witcher 3, Blood and Wine. Excellent work, delightful game, good environment. Although the graphics look a little outdated after 9 years, the approaches remain relevant. What's cool is that the artist showed us this, the geometry of the architecture, and we can clearly see that the entire structural geometry is a single mesh. It is not assembled from modules, but rather modeled quite straightforwardly from references or concepts, one structure after another. A little further down there was an even more interesting house. This house, a beautiful house. This house is a very good example of a bespoke approach to architecture in games. Everything here is made from a single mesh. It is a unique house, fully modeled and used in real production. And this choice for this game is understandable. They were building a city in the style of historical fantasy, again, the late Middle Ages, and they needed a certain number of houses with which they could build such a city. It is not difficult to create such a simple geometry. It is clear that they had standardized openings though, doors, windows, which they sewed into the walls. And that is, there's a certain modularity in the construction of this mesh, which of course remains within the framework of working in a 3D modeling application. No one suggests remodeling this arch every time. We copy it, insert it, and stitch the points together. And many criticize this approach for its speed of production compared to the modular approach, with which I disagree. For an artist who is comfortable with modeling, this approach will be faster than assembling a complex puzzle and creating new non-conforming modules in each individual instance for each architectural object. So here it is, shell and all kinds of elements that are repeated throughout the city, doors, bells, window shutters and so on, those very reusable standalone elements. And here we worked with corner meshes using the same principle. Look, shell itself doesn't have any neatly worked out corners, and in all cases a corner mesh will be used on top. So these questions I ask myself before deciding whether I need to work in a modular way, and if so, on what scale, and what the modular system will look like in order to be effective and help me rather than hinder me. Now let's go back to our cottage and draw a line under further plans. As a result, I will use this approach with separate modules. A wall with a window, corner of the building, and other modules with a width multiple of 2. Why, you may ask, since you just praised the bespoke method so much? And there are several reasons. First, I am concerned about displacement and the number of polygons we get as a result of using it. Because each wall of our kit, similar to this module, for example, will have about 10,000 triangles instead of these 44 polygons. If you remember from the previous video, our column cost us 20,000 polygons or so, and yes, it's nanite geometry, but still, I wouldn't want to have elements with 500,000 polygons. In theory, nanite technology cuts off invisible triangles even within a single model, and I showed this when we looked at the nanite over draw visualizer, but still, I'm wary of using such high polygonal objects. Maybe I'm being overly cautious, but I'm just saying it like it is. Therefore, occlusion of entire modules is still important, which means that this is the first reason to decompose our structural geometry into smaller elements. And I have no illusions about the reuse potential. I understand perfectly well that in this context, such fragmentation will be of little use to me. Especially when working with this one cottage. Returning to this mental exercise, how would we handle such a cottage if we were creating it for a real game? This question would only arise if we had several buildings in this architectural style, and even then, it would be a matter of debate how exactly to break down such walls and whether to do so at all. If our game did not use displacement, and if the interiors of this house weren't accessible in our game, then in my opinion, it would make sense to use such large blocks, thus a more bespoke approach. If we look at the reference, we may wonder where the displacement came from and why should we bother with it in this case. On the concept, we have a fairly smooth wall after all. But this is my personal decision. I want to try and test displacement in Unreal Engine 5 for architecture, and I want to make a surface a little more textured, with more grungy mix of materials, exposing more brick here and there. The second reason why I want to decompose these walls into a modular kit is that I want to show for the record what to do in situations where we already have a proxy mesh and now we need to make a modular kit out of it without breaking the proportions that we so carefully try to transfer from the concept art. But when creating the blockout, I naturally thought about which elements could be repeated, and how exactly I would decompose the cottage into modules. But with this architecture, building a blockout and a full-fledged modular system at the same time would be too difficult of a task. But this decomposition process can be quite interesting, and I would just like to talk about it and keep it on record. Another reason, it just so happens that my portfolio does not include demonstrations of decomposition and construction of modular kits, so I have a personal interest in this. I would also advise you not to repeat my mistake in your portfolios and to demonstrate your work with modular kits, their creation and planning as early as possible. And finally, I would say that, in principle, working within the framework of modular metrics is good practice. Even if we create fairly unique elements with low potential for reuse in other contexts, it is still good if, for example, the width of such walls is a multiple of 2 and the texture tiles correctly. It is good practice, and the right approach, when it does not take you twice as long to develop.